You have been watching Beneath the Surface, Detroit Public Television's documentary on the history and the controversy surrounding the Line 5 pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac. I'm Christy McDonald. Stay with us as we examine the latest issues, including damage to the line, Enbridge's cooperation with the state, and Line 5's future. It's a Great Lakes Now special coming up.
The Consumers Energy Foundation is committed to serving Michigan, from preserving our state's natural resources and sustaining our future, to continuing business growth, academic achievement, and community involvement. Learn more at consumersenergy.com/foundation.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from Mary Quilling and by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Christy McDonald, and thanks so much for joining me for this Great Lakes Now special on the latest concerns surrounding the pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac called Line 5. You've just watched Detroit Public Television's documentary on the line called Beneath the Surface. And there has been a lot of news in the past week surrounding the pipeline that pumps 23 million gallons of oil and natural gas liquids every day. It was shut down 2 weeks ago due to hazardous weather conditions, and the line also sustained damage from a ship dragging an anchor in the water this month. The state attorney general plans on charging that barge company for damaging Line 5 and other electrical cables. Enbridge says the pipeline is fine. There were 3 small dents, but crews are just now going below the surface with a remotely operated vehicle, or an ROV, to check the damage. The latest news has only increased calls for Enbridge, the company that operates Line 5, to shut the pipeline down. We are going to take a look at the latest concerns and the contingency plan should there ever be a spill. Plus, we'll talk pipeline regulations in the state. Also coming up, a debate over the governor's agreement with Enbridge and a behind-the-scenes look at the making of Beneath the Surface. All right, so let's get started with our first guest. Joining me now is Mike Shriberg. He is with the Great Lakes Office of the National Wildlife Federation and also a member of Michigan's Pipeline Safety Advisory Board. Mike, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And also Nick Schroeck. He's the director of the Transnational Environmental Law Clinic at Wayne State University. Nick, it is always good to see you as well.
Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, we've talked so much about Line 5, the safety of Line 5 over the last several years, and it feels like there has been this groundswell of chance of we need to shut this pipeline down, but there are so many other mitigating factors surrounding how would we get the oil and the natural gas liquids that would be coming through the state. But let's start and talk a little bit, Mike, about what has happened recently with the line and some of the concerns. Should we be so concerned about some of the damage that it's sustained recently?
Well, it shows just how vulnerable this pipeline is. We had an anchor dragged across it just recently, but that's in addition to things that we've learned, such as that some of the coating that's designed to protect the pipeline has been peeling away, and we have some bare metal exposed to water. So it's just one in a long series of incidents that shows us just how vulnerable it is, and frankly, that this is just the wrong place to have an oil and natural gas pipeline.
How concerned should we be right now, Nick, with the recent events that we've seen?
Well, as Mike said, I mean, this is just, I think it adds a little bit of fuel to the fire towards trying to look at what is next for this pipeline. I mean, we're seeing more calls for decommissioning, meaning shutting it down, or coming up with some other way to transport this oil, these other materials around the region. And so the anchor strike, which this is something that it wasn't like this just was completely unanticipated that this could never happen.
Right.
In fact, in the risk assessment that was done for the pipeline, anchor strike was one of the top risks that could actually pose a threat to this pipeline. So again, it just sort of, I think, adds to this momentum to look at what we're going to do as far as a more safe option for transporting oil around the region. Okay,
so I guess the bigger question people take a look at is say, okay, well, who's responsible for regulating this? And who's responsible for making sure that Enbridge does the due diligence that they have to in terms of maintenance of the pipeline and making sure that when they check things, if things are faulty, and fixing them, and making sure that we know exactly what's going on beneath the surface, Mike? Yeah, I mean, there's a combination here. The federal agencies are responsible for the regulation, but the state itself has a huge responsibility here. The only reason that Enbridge is allowed to put a pipeline along the bottom of the Straits of Mackinac is because they have an easement with the state. So think of it as a lease, but actually the difference is they're not paying rent or anything like that. So the state actually has an obligation to oversee this pipeline, and we believe the time has come for the state to actually say,
to revoke this easement, to say no longer possible to utilize the straits in this way.
So you're on the Pipeline Advisory Board, though. Then what is the board's role in taking a look at what's happening with Line 5?
Yeah, our board's role is really two things. One, to provide good public information about what's happening with the pipeline and with pipeline safety. And the second is to provide advice and input to Governor Snyder. That's explicitly the role of this board.
So, Nick, when we take a look at what's happening right now and the trust or the mistrust that people have with Enbridge, is that misplaced? There has been some transparency issues with the company that people feel are very valid.
Yeah, I think that people are right to question the information that we're receiving from Enbridge. Going back several years ago now, I mean, one of the reasons we even know about, the main reason that we know about some of the issues with support structures under this pipeline is because National Wildlife Federation actually sent a crew down to videotape the pipeline. You had all sorts of people clamoring for years for information about this pipeline. Is it safe? Are there any maintenance issues, that type of thing? And we really didn't receive any information. So it ended up being a group outside of government that actually funded a camera to go down there and look at it. And then we started to get more information from Enbridge. But it just shows you that they were resistant to sharing any of that, whether it was a maintenance issue or whether they had been actually properly maintaining the structure itself with the public until they were forced to do so.
So you look at a pipeline that's 65 years old and was put in a different time in how we deal with the lakes right now, and the environmental concerns of if something should happen, how we actually clean it up and what would actually happen in the straits. And we've seen some pretty, I think, a kind of a harrowing simulation from the Coast Guard in terms of what the currents and what the shifting would be. Nick, go ahead and give me a sense of who has the contingency plan for some kind of cleanup should there be some kind of spill?
Well, and first, just to take a step back, I mean, when this pipeline was put in place in 1963. I mean, this is pre-Clean Water Act. This is pre our National Environmental Policy Act, which that's what requires federal review of all these major infrastructure projects. So when this easement was granted by the state of Michigan, we didn't go through all of those environmental assessments that are commonplace today. So we're having to go back and kind of reverse engineer what could happen if you had a major spill. And so, you have multiple different agencies that would be responding to a catastrophic spill or any spill there in the Great Lakes. So you have the Coast Guard, you have the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, as well as a key group of stakeholders that includes the tribes. And it's important to note, I mean, this is a very key issue for our tribal nations here in the state of Michigan. I mean, this is territory that originally they ceded to the state of Michigan, and they retained fishing rights for subsistence fishing in the Straits of Mackinac. And so, anyway, they're part of that response too, and they should always have a seat at the table in discussing, what the future is of this pipeline. So we didn't have a lot of the assessments done on the front end like we would if we were developing a new pipeline today. You'd have these very comprehensive environmental assessments. So now the work that Mike and others are doing on the advisory board and contracting with various academics to look at, what kind of worst case scenario, what that would look like, and then how we would go about trying to clean it up. And doing that work has led to a lot of advocates saying, gosh, should we really even have this pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac in the first place? Looking at these consequences, which could again just be devastating, is there a better way to move this product around the region?
Yeah, and I think when you look at how we should be studying, is there a better way to move this product around the region? Mike, give me a sense of what the cleanup plan would be and who would take the lead in that. Is that the Coast Guard that has simulation plans saying, should something happen, we're going to go here, and then does Enbridge help come in, or they are just footing the bill for if there was any kind of spill? Well,
it's a combination of the two, and you have to think. There is no reasonable recovery plan for the Straits of Mackinac, all right? Because you've got flow there that can go 10 times the flow of Niagara Falls. But even more perilous than Niagara Falls, some days it can be going from Lake Huron to Lake Michigan, some days the other way around. The bottom, middle, and upper parts can be going different directions. Add to that the notorious wind and waves there, and the fact that you have ice a good chunk of the year. So when you actually get to cleanup, it is some combination of the Coast Guard and Enbridge themselves. But when you actually think about it, there is no reasonable plan for recovery. The chances of any significant recovery are slim to none. So we have to think about prevention, not recovery in this case.
And Enbridge says that the line is fine and that they are doing maintenance on it, and they are doing some things even this summer to try to shore up some supports where it is, under the lake where it doesn't have some of that support, where it's just straight. And we did ask Enbridge spokesman to appear on the show tonight. We will have a statement from them coming up, lest people think that we're just one-sided on this conversation. We will hear from them. But talk to me about some of the significant changes and maintenance they're going to be doing this summer, Mike, and what kind of difference that could possibly make.
Yeah, and and I don't say this lightly, but Enbridge has not been a credible actor on this. And I say that from experience. I mean, sitting on the Governor's Pipeline Safety Advisory Board, Enbridge came to us March of last year and said the coating around the pipeline is fully intact. Turned out that was false information, and Enbridge, at least somebody in the company, knew that ahead of time. Turns out you have at least 48 places where the coating is actually missing, completely gone, or partially gone. That's a big safety risk. I mean, it doesn't take a chemist to know that exposing bare metal to water can cause corrosion. Corrosion is the #1 cause of pipeline failure. Add to that the supports. It's supposed to be supported every 75 feet. We have found out that there have been times where it's been over 200 feet where it's not been supported. So Enbridge right now is trying to go back and put in these supports. We actually don't know what the impacts of that had been over time. Think about that. If something's not been supported the way it should, it starts to sag, it starts to bend, and there's a possibility of breakage. We are unconvinced about the stability of this line over the long term, in part, honestly, due to the poor practices of Enbridge and the lack of honesty and integrity in how they've brought that information forward. Our state leaders have lost a lot of their trust and faith in Enbridge. They've been very forthright about that.
How often do they inspect the pipeline?
They're required to every 2 years.
Okay. And then report the findings to the state, and then the state has to take them at their value of what the findings were, correct?
Well, right, and that's one of the frustrating things with a lot of our environmental permitting is basically that we rely on the industry that's regulated to actually report to our government what are they polluting, or in this case, what type of maintenance and inspections have they carried out. And looking at what just happened a couple weeks ago with this anchor drag hitting the power lines from ATC Power, look at the response there. I mean, so we're just now getting video from these ROVs that you mentioned at the top of the show. And it's not really, it doesn't give you a lot of confidence that we'd have a quick, rapid response to an incident when we can't even get video or footage of these power lines that were damaged by this anchor. Now, again, it's been a couple weeks. And so anyway, we talk about response plans, we talk about all of these contingencies they have in place, but this has sort of been a test run for some of those contingencies, and it hasn't been very effective.
Well, let me ask you this, though. Bottom line, what is the alternative to this pipeline when you do have to make sure that industry can exist with the environment? And I know that's a struggle that we've had for decades. But what is an alternative to what's happening with Line 5?
Well, I think it's still an open question as to whether or not there's enough pipeline capacity, shore-based pipelines. So without going through the Straits of Mackinac, but going around the Great Lakes, that's one of the things that the consultants looked at as perhaps an alternative. And I think that's something we really need to look. Is there a way through existing pipelines that are not going through the Straits of Mackinac to move this product around? That's number one. I think when you start looking at rail transport or using tankers, ships, barges on the Great Lakes, all of those have their own risks.
Correct.
And we're very concerned about that. So frankly, it's looking at using existing land-based pipelines and then also trying over the longer term to think really critically about how we can reduce our dependency on petroleum products, on oil. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. As long as there's a demand for refined oil, for gasoline, we're going to continue moving it around the region to get to refineries. And so that's where we need to think longer term about how we can address those challenges.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, one thing we haven't really talked about, Show, is that most of Line 5 is throughput. So it's derived from Canada and it's using the Great Lakes as a shortcut. There's a very small portion of it that remains in the state. The good news is, as Nick was talking about, there are substitutes for that. Of course, there's no substitute for the Great Lakes. So when we're talking about it, we know that those services that are provided, the very small amount for the state, there are good substitutes, either existing pipelines or other mechanisms. But remember, almost all of the pipeline flows through Michigan. It doesn't actually provide any services. So the question is, we are actually sustaining all of the risk for very little of the benefit. And our state leaders have to think about that.
What are we using, about 30%?
That's Enbridge's estimate. Other independent analysts have said it's more like 5%. We don't actually know because a lot of that's proprietary information.
So let me ask you this then. How much would it cost for them to reroute that pipeline? For them to say, you know what, we're going to figure out an entirely different way. And again, we're looking at the cost analysis of doing business versus looking at the environment.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know, Mike, if you know an overall cost, but they've looked at things like impacts to gasoline prices, which of course people care about. And it was, I think, just a matter of a few cents would be the impact if you actually were to shut down Line 5 or move that product in another way. And so, really for some pocket change per household in this state, you could look at potentially shutting down this pipeline, and that would be the impact. So I think for a lot of people, that's a reasonable trade-off.
The bottom line right now, the state of Michigan is working with Enbridge, and they have a deal with them right now saying that you have to comply with some transparency, you have to apply with monitoring, and you have to take a look at a study and kind of give us the options if we wanted to decommission the line. Where do you see the regulation or the role of Michigan right now? Are we as strong as we need to be, Mike?
Well, the governor and the attorney general have both said that they want Line 5 to be decommissioned. The question is when and how you get to the replacement. So we've had a lot of talk about decommissioning. What we need is for our state leaders to actually start moving forward and take that action. We know that the substitutes are there. We know that Michigan could absolutely sustain not having Line 5. I can't imagine a Michigan where the Great Lakes are polluted with oil from it.
All right, Mike Shriberg, Nick Schroeck, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. It's good to see you both. We did ask Enbridge to be a part of our show. We spent a lot of time with them during the production of our documentary to get an idea of the daily operations and safety. Enbridge spokesman Ryan Duffy is featured in the documentary Beneath the Surface.
Line 5 is very safe. We understand people's concerns. We understand their strong feelings about protecting the Straits and the Great Lakes. And the thing is, we share those concerns. We want to protect the Straits and the Great Lakes more than anybody. We've been in Michigan for 65 years now. We consider Michigan to be home. And so we want to be a good neighbor. And we want to operate the line very safely. We feel like the best way to protect the Straits and the Great Lakes and at the same time meet energy needs is to operate Line 5 safely, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
Duffy also sent this statement. He said, quote, Enbridge is taking immediate action to assess appropriate reinforcing repairs following the incident in the Straits of Mackinac. We are committed to safely operating Line 5 well into the future, and our focus remains on our agreement with the state of Michigan. We hope Michigan residents find peace of mind in knowing the 7 actions contained within the agreement are designed to enhance safety as well as protection of the Great Lakes. Well, the state of Michigan entered into an agreement with Enbridge that makes the company more accountable for maintenance, monitoring, and future safety studies. And recently I sat down with Detroit News columnist Daniel Howes and WDET's Stephen Henderson on our show My Week, and we debated whether the agreement between the state of Michigan and Enbridge is tough enough to head off any potential environmental disaster.
I think the likelihood that they move that line is probably less than taking some of the measures that they're agreeing to take. What's clear to me is that Enbridge has come to the conclusion that they are going to have to remove their pipeline from contact with the Great Lakes. So whether that means putting in a concrete tunnel underneath the Great Lakes or some other way, they don't have a whole lot of choice. The governor, I think, is also in a situation, looking at this from kind of a macro legacy standpoint. We have got 1/5 of the world's fresh water here. We've already been blemished badly by the Flint water crisis, and that happened on his watch. You would think that if there's any state in the union that should have robust water management, it should be the state of Michigan. So, and I think he probably understands that, and he's moving very aggressively. The other thing that I think is important here is the political reality of an effort to get a ballot question on the 18 ballot. And if they do, that could cause a lot of more problems for the government of his successor, as well as for Enbridge, because now you have the people of the state of Michigan taking a position on something, and it makes things a lot harder, and it limits their options.
Okay, and so you say that the move by Governor Snyder was aggressive this week. Would you agree with that?
I don't think it was that aggressive. I think, first of all, I mean, it interrupts the process that we're going through, which is trying to study this line and get accurate information about the line and the future of the line.
And there is a
all
pipeline advisory board of the state of Michigan right now.
But does it interrupt it?
I think it interrupts it in this way. It pushed just a little bit of the thumb of the scale on the side of keeping the pipe or keeping access to the lakes for this pipeline. It says, let's try this thing that we are pretty sure is going to work a lot better, and then it puts more of the burden on the folks who say, let's get rid of this. I think your point about what the governor should be thinking about water and water management is absolutely right.
Exactly right.
And he should be saying, no way, this does not make sense. It is an accident, literally an accident waiting to happen. And the question is when, not if. And so when you're in that kind of situation, I think you say, let's talk about what the other alternatives would look like. They may be expensive, but they will not cost humanly as much.
It's also looking at this deal too and giving Enbridge the benefit of the doubt to fix the mistakes that they have made in the past and to do better.
But they're liars. I mean,
and they don't have a good track record here. And if you want to find a corporate villain, there are few more likely corporate villains than energy companies that are not transparent, right? So I think they're doing what they can do in this case. But the other thing that strikes me too is they also said that they would shut down Line 5 under the Straits of Mackinac when wave heights get...
When the conditions...
Well, I looked into that. Wave heights of 8 feet sustained for 60 minutes. Now, I've paddled on the Great Lakes, and 8-foot waves are terrifying, okay? And if they're sustained for 60 minutes, it's huge. But the reality is even when those waves are half that size, a lot of rescue groups, the Coast Guard and others,
it's not even safe enough to get there to stop
and
the oil.
that's part of the problem.
Well, let's talk about winter, right? Winter up there is the worst weather that we have. They're not going to stop operation of the pipeline during the winter.
And you can't get under the ice.
A winter break would be catastrophic. I mean, it would be really tough to deal with.
So it's a wait and see again, would you say?
I feel like the governor is in a wait and see, and he shouldn't be. I think he should be more, his obligation first is to the people of the state of Michigan.
True.
And our interests here are clear. You can't do this. He's trying to strike a balance between those interests and those of a business, and I think that's where he gets himself in
Last word, Daniel.
Business is, I've written about this twice, Michigan business is not aggressive and publicly outspoken enough about this. If something goes badly wrong, Michigan business and the Michigan economy will be very much
devastated.
Suffer. And Enbridge is working on a study to see what other options they have if they move Line 5. That study is due in June. And finally, I sat down with our Great Lakes Now Bureau Chief, Mary Ellen Geist, who produced the documentary Beneath the Surface, for some perspective on the history of the pipeline and what happens next. The thing that I think really bothers people, and it's been this conflict for so long, is the protection of the lakes and this natural resource that we have here in the Midwest, and really, 20% of the world's surface freshwater right here in the Great Lakes, and the potential for something to happen, and that conflict with industry, because we know that industry has to exist, and the economics of moving petroleum. And if you shut down that pipeline, what is your alternative? Is your alternative to ship it in a different way, across the water in a different way? So we have that conflict which has existed for a very long time. Where do you see the conversations sort of moving between regulation and protection?
There is a groundswell now, and partly because of what happened just this week, which is why it's so timely what's going on. There was a case, as you mentioned, with an anchor denting a portion of the steel exterior of the pipeline. That in itself scares people so much. However, Enbridge says it is safe. It pumps 23 million gallons of oil each day from Superior, Wisconsin to Sarnia, Ontario. And it has this little section, 4.5 miles, between the lower and upper peninsula. And what everybody, I think, says is we need this gas, we need this oil. About 30% of that does go to Michigan and to be used by Michiganders. But a lot of it's taken to Canada, and they just say, why does it have to go in this sensitive area of the Great Lakes where 23 million gallons of oil, even if some of that came out, if there was a puncture, would damage fish, wildlife, the recreation industry. We were able to interview Dave Schwab at the University of Michigan, who did an incredible study of a simulation of the oil going along.
Of where it would go. It's really quite staggering.
740 miles, he says, would be affected. However, Enbridge says that's just a wind and substance, what substances would do in the lake, we would clean that up immediately. They dispute this study and say the cleanup would happen so it wouldn't affect the shoreline. Again, you've got the dispute. Environmental activists completely disagree with what Enbridge says. But if it was allowed to keep pumping and was not cleaned up, it would soil 740 miles of shoreline and could damage much of the Great Lakes.
So I think that's very interesting, because when people think about if there perhaps is a spill and you're looking at the current and the wind speed, because that is such a interesting place where you have those two lakes that are meeting. Who is responsible for any kind of cleanup should something like that happen, and how easy or how difficult would it be to contain?
As we know, when this spill happened in 2010 in Kalamazoo, billions of dollars was spent by Enbridge. It is Enbridge's responsibility to pay for the cleanup. However, we interviewed Coast Guard and all the emergency response, the Michigan State Police. So many people would have to be involved in this cleanup effort. They are amassing. We actually filmed them doing emergency measures about what would happen if there was a spill. Ultimately, it's on Enbridge. But what is happening right now is people look at legal ways, who are very against this pipeline, to try to shut it down. They believe that one of the ways they can help to do that is to insist that Enbridge have a fund set up and a huge increase in insurance, so that if a spill happened and even could affect much of the Great Lakes, that they paid for it, and that the billions of dollars they would have to pay might help put them out of business. That is what environmental activists want to do right now.
And our thanks to Mary Ellen. If you missed Beneath the Surface, make sure to find it at greatlakesnow.org, along with all of the stories that we're covering that impact the amazing natural resource that surrounds us, the Great Lakes. We're also on Facebook, and we are on Twitter at Great Lakes Now. Tell us what you'd like to see. Thanks so much for joining us. For all of us at Detroit Public TV, I'm Christy McDonald. We'll see you next time.
The Consumers Energy Foundation is committed to serving Michigan, from preserving our state's natural resources and sustaining our future, to continuing business growth, academic achievement, and community involvement. Learn more at consumersenergy.com/foundation.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from Mary Quilling and by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.